Hi, I'm Len Epp from Leanpub, and in this episode of the Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing John Koster. Based in the greater Grand Forks area in North Dakota, John is a software developer, blogger, and book author with over 15 years of professional experience on a wide range of projects, including web development and critical government reporting applications. You can follow him on Twitter at John M. Koster and check out his blog at stalat.com. John is the author of the Leanpub books Advanced PHP Strings, Text Analysis, Generation, and Parsing via Laravel, and Laravel Companion 2nd Edition. In Advanced PHP Strings, and I'm borrowing directly from the book description on Leanpub here, John provides an approachable guide through reading, writing, looping, and parsing multi-byte strings through hundreds of hands-on examples using the Laravel helper methods as a familiar foundation. In this interview, we're going to talk about John's background and career, professional interests, his books, and at the end, we'll talk a little bit about his experience writing and self-publishing. So thank you very much, John, for being on the Leanpub Front Matter podcast. I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you grew up and, how your first computer and how you got into programming.
My first computer was one that my mom actually bought. I think it was 5 or 6, and she was at a garage sale, and she just saw this little computer box, and she's like, well, that looks interesting. We don't have anything like that at home. She just brought it home one day and sat it up, and the only thing that would work on it was just a terminal display with a 8-inch floppy. Then you put it in, it was Oregon Trail, and that was the only thing you could do with it. And
right.
So you would hammer away at that and, find interesting ways to die of dysentery every day. And that was my introduction to computers. And then from that, it was about a year or so later, I was at just a local church yard sale, and I picked up a Windows 3.1 machine that they were getting rid of. And that's when I really started to get into like graphical interfaces or like computers in general. Just like you go from that black screen with the green text, and you're like, I can drag and drop stuff around, and Windows 3.1, this is amazing, this is the greatest thing in the world. And so that's kind of where I got into it and kind of been hooked on it ever since.
And I'm sort of curious about your first experience programming. I was mentioning before we started recording that this podcast has become a bit of a time capsule of like different eras of computing. So there are some people who are like, for a lot of people actually, it was like printed magazines that they type in programs from printed magazines, and they'd buy those and type those into their computer. What was your first experience with programming?
My first experience with programming was my dad. He was doing some university stuff at the time when I was really young. He went into computers, and he was bringing home textbooks and stuff like that. And when he wasn't busy with his university computer, then I would like sneak onto it, then follow along with the books and kind of do stuff like that. And then from there, it's like, well, what's a web page? How does that work? And then you start ripping things apart and trying to get something to work, and kind of becomes an addictive cycle.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I can't tell you how many people, it's a sort of parent bringing a computer. I mean, obviously, if it's your kid, the parent's probably initiating it. But for a lot of people, it's a parent bringing it into the home for one reason, and then the kid finds another reason to use it and play around with it. And so I'm just looking at your LinkedIn page here. And so I gather you studied computer science?
Yeah, I did about 3.5, 4 years at Naval State University here in Naval, North Dakota. That went reasonably well. I don't think I would consider myself a very good student. And it ended up dropping out probably right at the end of the last semester for various reasons. So.
And that's actually interesting. One question that comes up relatively frequently on this podcast is, if you were starting out now, would you go to university and study computer science again, with the intention of having a career like the one that you've had?
I've thought about this a lot over the years, and if you would have asked me this question, let's say 2 or 3 years ago, I would have been like, no, just absolutely not. It was a waste of time, and then my position softened over time, and it's like, did I gain much from university as far as like computer science goes? No, not really. But all of the other things that go along with it, like that's where the true value is. So if you have I would say to other people, if they were thinking similar thoughts, is like, if you have the opportunity to go, you definitely should, because like, yeah, you're going to do coursework in your field of interest, but it's all that other stuff that you're going to get exposed to that really makes the experience worth it.
Yeah, it's funny. You took the words out of my mouth. That's my line about all that, is that like, one of my joking things, which is also true, is like people like doctors and lawyers and professors aren't so kind of not intimidating, but like impressive if you were there drinking with them when you were 18 and the teachers were uncertain. And you can remember, I remember you before you were, you know,
Yeah,
a brain
exactly.
surgeon or whatever, you know, like, and like it sounds trivial, but actually being going through, I'm talking specifically about being young and going to university, which of course is not a necessary thing, but all these things that you're exposed to. And like I was also mentioning before this podcast, I come originally from Saskatchewan, a little bit north of you. And so I don't need to tell you that it's like in many senses a very remote place. And when I grew up was sort of like, you know, just before the web. Right. And so like when I was a kid, and so like it was even more remote in a way than things are now. And being able to go to a university where there's just like classes on everything, people taking everything, you know, libraries with books on everything, and then the time to engage with all that stuff is just amazing, and it gives you powers that maybe you forget you earned through that time. So I totally agree with you that it's like, you know, there's so much else going on beyond the sort of specific subjects that you study when it comes to university education.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's, especially nowadays, like you mentioned, there's so much material and other ways to get to where you want to go that if you really want to do something, you'll find a way to do it.
Yeah. And it is interesting too, though. I should mention, you know, like I would say about a quarter of the people that I interview are in the forget about it kind of mode. Don't go. If you want to be, if you're looking for job training for a job in programming, don't go. There's like a pretty high proportion of people who are very adamant about that. And they have their own very good reasons for staying in that position. And so you sort of, you know, studied, and then you went to work, and I know you've done some interesting work for government, I think on like highway infrastructure data or something like that. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about, you know, what that work entailed and what the government was doing.
Yeah. So the boring answer to that is it's a simple records management system that was developed for them, and them being select counties within the state of North Dakota. And what they do is they send out people to work on the roads, the highway systems. So it tracks everything from their employee management, like resource management, down to materials cost, equipment use, just anything that you could think of as far as that goes. And then various reporting around that, you know, like if they need to dispatch a report to FEMA or finance reports to the local government all the way up to the state government.
Actually, every once in a while I take the opportunity to ask a completely selfish question. So I'm going to ask that now. This is one of my hobby horses, but did they at the time gather data on the noise that they created from the work that they did?
No, that would be super interesting if they did, though. You're talking about like decibel levels, or
but actually, in the sort of noise community, there's two things that sort of people. I think there's two things. It's basically it is decibel level, and then there's something else technical about like basically how penetrating I think it is that has to do with kind of pitch and stuff like that. And I ask because I live in a city where like the city administration is just absolutely addicted to the use of machinery. Just today I had like this horrible experience where some guys were actually like practicing with this. I won't even go into the details. Some crazy leaf collection monstrosity, and just in front of my apartment building, they were just practicing. And it's hard to explain. Like it would have disturbed and made life unlivable for probably 1,000 people what they were doing. And I've often thought, like, of course, some things do involve noise, but if cities and administrations that actually do loud things actually just kept track of, like, they might realize, oh, you know what, we're doing way too much in this one part of town, or like, you know what, that part of the country has had way too much kind of invasive stuff going on in it. Why don't we sort of schedule things so that we don't do another thing this month?
Yeah, that would be interesting. Almost makes you wonder if they don't collect the information so they don't have to act on it. Like, you know, if you think about like the noise restrictions around like airports and stuff like that.
Oh,
So maybe
I absolutely think that that's one of the reasons that people don't collect data on it, which is very unfortunate. But yeah, but no, that I mean that math, I mean that's the kind of like one of the reasons I was interested in asking about that is like that's the kind of work that actually like keeps the roads running, right? You know, like you need getting data on this kind of thing, and the kind of things that sort of programmers enable is basically like a sort of infinite variety of just so many important things. And a lot of people, I think, don't understand. Like you when you think of like the least computer thing, you know, that might be like highway maintenance, but of course, you know, this technology is behind everything. Um, and what kind of work are you doing now?
my day-to-day work largely involves it's in the telematics industry, so GPS tracking and fleet maintenance and fleet management and route optimization, and all the things that kind of go along with that.
And is that for government or is that private sector?
That's private sector.
Okay, okay. Yeah, and that must be an interesting thing too to experience things from both of those sides. But in addition to your work, of course, you create a lot of content, and you not only content, but you work on all these really interesting projects. And I'm not sure exactly what the best way into that is, but like, at what point did you find yourself blogging?
I think, well, this kind of goes back to the university. I had a professor, his name was Terry, and part of the curriculum, he was like, you're going to learn a lot of things. You're going to do a lot of things. You're going to forget a lot of things. He's like, so part of the coursework was like, if you find something interesting or like it took you a little while, just write yourself a private blog post, kind of a journal for yourself. Because, you can spend all day on Google searching for things, or spend hours and hours in Stack Overflow. But if you have something that you curated yourself, like yourself the best, so put your own notes, look there first going forward. And that was kind of the impetus of the start of the blog that I have now.
That's really interesting. So you were sort of solving your own problems, and then it's like, why do I keep all my solutions private? Just make them
right. So that's where that came from. So that the blog now is almost, over 10 years old now, actually this month. So it's been going for quite a while.
Yeah, congratulations. There's just so much on there, and in addition to sort of all the other things that you do, sort of write about your own projects. And so I was wondering, for example, if you could talk about one or two with them, like what is the Antlers Toolbox?
The Antlers Toolbox, that's a fun one. Bring it up here so I can reference it. So Antlers Toolbox there's this templating language called Antlers for the Statimic UMass platform, and it's designed to kind of help you get, you design your content and your site structure, and then the Antlers language lets you quickly get that on screen and just move on with your work. And when I started really getting into it, like there wasn't a whole lot of tools available to kind of help you do that, as far as like syntax highlighting, so you could see the difference between like what should be plain text or HTML, or what's an actual variable that you're trying to output dynamically on the screen. So I started the Antlers Toolbox because there was a existing tool at the time that just did the syntax highlighting to make it look pretty. And there was this like a weird bug in it where it would kind of do it halfways and then it would like stop working. And he's like, hey, why does this happen? And I looked at it, I'm like, well, that's certainly interesting. I think I'll take a look at it this weekend, see if I can fix it. And what usually happens happened there. And I started looking into it and took things way too far. And then about 9 months later, then we had the fixed syntax highlighting, auto completion, IntelliSense, like understanding your project and providing smart suggestions for you.
Oh, it's really great. And yeah, everyone interested in checking it out, you can check it out at antlers.dev, which is, by the way, a great web address. And another project you've got is, and actually I should mention, did you mention Statimic in your answer there?
I did.
Yeah. Can you explain a little bit about what that is?
Yeah. So everybody, I think, would be fairly familiar. Like if you were to mention like systems like WordPress or like Squarespace and stuff like that, they just help you build websites. Statimic is a similar tool to that, where you can go in there and set up, this is what I want my data to look like, and this is what I want the editing experience to look like, and this is how I want to do it, and this is how I want my workflow to be. So if like you want to use like a Git integration to automatically back up every change that's made to your site, you can just do that. Or you want to drop the control panel admin interface entirely. You can do that. You can just use a text editor if you want. But then just super, super flexible, powerful content management system. It's almost like the Leanpub of content management systems. Like you can drop right down to a plain text file if you want and just go at it.
And is it Laravel based?
It is. The latest versions really let the Laravel influence shine through. So.
Okay. Yeah. So just before we go on to talk about a little bit about your first book and the second edition, they were both called Laravel Companion. We've actually had Taylor Otwell on the podcast a couple of times, so there may be people here who know what Laravel is, but just in your own words, for someone who's never heard of it before, doesn't know what it is, what's Laravel?
Laravel is a framework to assist you in application development. And more specifically, it just kind of gets all of these stuff that you probably didn't want to do anyways out of the way for you, and then provides a lot of useful utilities like database management, authentication, just all of that stuff just right out of the box. So ignore all the stuff you probably didn't want to do anyways, just get right to building your application.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a great, very compact answer. And so your first, I mentioned your first Leanpub book was Laravel Companion, and it's now in a second edition. What was the origin story of that book?
Yeah, so this actually gets back to the origins of the blog in general, is like keeping track of my own notes. And sometimes I can have difficulty learning a subject. So like I end up taking a lot of notes, and like I was moving from primarily .NET environments, like C#, Visual Basic, ASP.NET. And then I was kind of like playing around with like PHP and frameworks like Symfony and related, and just looking into Laravel, and it's just like, a lot of this stuff is similar to what I've been doing, but it's not similar enough where I'm not going to remember this. And so I just kept on taking notes and writing my own documentation essentially as I went through the code base for Laravel.
Yeah, no, that's super sort of in a way kind of generous of you to share it. And this, I think, is common sort of trait that Leanpub authors have, which is like, I've solved all these problems, and like, even if I've got a blog, like, why don't I make a book and sort of put all things into shape, in a coherent shape, so people will have one place to go. And your latest book is now called Advanced PHP Strings, Text Analysis, Generation, and Parsing via Laravel. I've got a specific thing I think I want to ask you about there, but just before we do that, what was the origin story of this book?
So it ties back to the Antlers Toolbox and related projects, actually. So like when you go and you build something to do the kind of textual analysis, like as you're typing and trying to figure out what, as developers typing into their code editor, what is it that they're probably trying to do? Like, what do they mean? Even if the document's like all broken. So you're going to have to be able to like parse text very quickly and handle all sorts of garbage input on the fly. And a lot of the techniques and strategies to do that it's obvious once you know where to look, but not obvious to get to that point. And so this kind of gets back to the whole thing of like taking a bunch of notes, and Advanced PHP Strings kind of comes out of that. It's like, here's a huge collection of things that I picked up over the last 3 or 4 years working on these different projects. And one, other people can look at it, but two, now I can forget about it. And when I need to learn it again, I'll just go look at my notes.
And when we talk about strings, so this is actually really interesting. So for anyone listening who's like not a programmer, we're going to actually explain something super cool right now. Hopefully we'll get there, because at the beginning of John's book, he explains in detail, in a very clear way, how the representation of characters on computer screens is sort of worked out, and its history, and it's super fascinating. The sort of framing I'll give for this is a while ago, one of our best-selling authors had a relative who was like, "Oh, I'd like to use this Leanpub thing," but this person was a very, very smart, very knowledgeable, but not a programmer. And so when they encountered Leanpub and some of our writing modes, you can write in plain text and using something called Markua, which is a plain text kind of syntax for writing books. It's markdown for books, right? If you're a technical person, everything I said probably more or less kind of made sense. And if you're 99.9% of people, it was all like nonsense. And she eventually goes, "Look, I see this word Markua everywhere. is it bigger than a bread box? Like what the heck is it? And so I took the time after that, after laughing about it, because it was very funny the way she put it, was to write an article about like from a fun kind of like historical and kind of like starting from a non-technical perspective, like what's going on with the input and the output of sort of characters in computers. And it's really interesting. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about, let's say, what a character is.
Yeah, so that's one of those interesting things that you don't really think about too much during the day, isn't it? So if you look at the screen now, like or on your phone, you see like the letters, like the THE, and then you're thinking, well, that's interesting, that's cool. Like I see little graphical things on the screen, and then you start thinking about it a little bit more. He's like, well, it's got to save that somewhere. And then if you think about it, well, you can't save the letters themselves because I can move that between computers, and that could possibly be problematic. So then you start thinking of how you might be able to do that. And then eventually everybody kind of intuitively knows that these things that we call computers and smartphones, they all operate on these ones and zeros. And then we got to find a way to get all of those little individual characters to that. And then quickly becomes a mess,
Yeah, and it's one of the really interesting things about it is that, so yeah, as you say, so everything that's sort of on a computer is eventually broken down into ones and zeros.
Mm-hmm.
There's all kinds of cool information theory reasons about that, and bits and bytes and stuff like that. But in the you can imagine, like in the early days, everybody who was making computers kind of just came up with their own, like 101 is an A. 111 is a B, like they came up with their own mapping, right? And the way you can think about why this matters is, for example, and I think you bring this up, like, is like, if let's say I'm communicating with someone using text, right? And I want them to have text in the end, but let's say we use a word a lot, right? Like, in my own notation, the word individual, I just use the letter I if I'm writing something down quickly, like sort of shorthand, right? So you can actually compress, you can use these kinds of things to compress. But if I go like, if I turn a sentence like the individual went to the store to the I went to the store, then I have to, if someone else is going to read that, they have to have a shared kind of map or whatever so that they can decode it. And in a way that, in the early days of computing, from what I understand, is people actually had all kinds of everybody who was doing stuff did stuff a different way. So computers actually couldn't read each other, basically. It would be sort of the cartoonish way of putting it. And so what people needed was a sort of settled convention for like what sets of zeros and ones are the character A, and what set of zeros and ones is the character B. And it was actually the Lyndon Johnson administration that helped bring about the kind of, I don't know, the sort of set of conventions. That's correct, right?
Yeah. What he did is I forget the exact year at the point, but he kind of just stepped in and said, like, if you're going to be working with the U.S. government, you're going to use this specific standard.
Right.
And that way, we don't have this problem of, we pretty much, I would assume, I wasn't there, but it probably came down to money. It's like, we don't want to have all of these systems that can't talk to each other in 5 years or whatever. And then, of course, if you think about that, like if you have the U.S. government saying, like, we're going to use this standard, well, probably a good reason why it's still around.
Yeah, definitely. And so then we've got sort of this sort of ASCII standard, right? And I was wondering if, like, just to give you an opportunity to sort of give people a little bit of an understanding of how the interesting sort of technical stuff behind this. What's the difference between like sort of ASCII and Unicode?
Okay, so we can start with the way they're similar, and that is, let's say you have your list of letters, and it's just a way to get those letters, those characters, into the ones and zeros that we're going to store somewhere and then transmit, and then other people can take them back out and read it. ASCII is one of the older standards, and it kind of covers the English character set, the numbers, and a handful of control characters and stuff. But importantly, it's a 7-bit encoding system, so you can keep everything nice and neat, and in 7 bits. At the time was the byte size, and nowadays we use 8 bits per byte. It still holds the ASCII values. So Unicode comes into play, Because if you think about it, you only have 7 bits. There's a limited number of values you can store. If you only work with English text, probably never thought about it. Like, it handles English just fine. But now you want to start looking at like Japanese, Chinese, Korean, even, languages like German, they got like the different accents, like the umlauts and all that stuff. Like, you're going to run out of numbers to start assigning to these characters really quick if you just stick in that limited, 0 to 255 range. So that's kind of where Unicode comes in and just extends the range of values that you can start assigning to characters.
Yeah, and it's interesting just to sort of go into the real detail there. So like a bit is a 1 or a 0, basically, and a byte is a set of bits. So if you're using a 7-bit byte like ASCII does, you can have 7 1s or 0s in a row. Each one of them has to be a 1 or a 0, and then the binary counting is basically being used to sort of turn those into integers or numbers like 255 or something like that, right? And then the 255, then somewhere that we know, that is a Z or something like that. Which is the way it works. So now that we've got this idea, then there's I think with Unicode, if I remember correctly, that there can be multiple bytes that sort of map to a character.
Right. So the nice thing about what Unicode did is it's like, okay, we're going to preserve the ASCII range. So 1 byte per character. So nothing that was working with ASCII, that all works. It's not going to break. Make Lyndon B. Johnson happy. But like, as you mentioned, like as you get into the other characters, and I use Chinese characters a lot in the book because I think, if you're only grew up in English, like you see Chinese and you're like, oh, that looks difficult. That looks hard. So what we do in Unicode is we specifically choose a value in a range that would never be part of the ASCII range, and be like, we're going to use that as the first byte. And if you see that value, then you can expect 2 other bytes to follow it to complete the full character. Or if you see a range and a certain value, then like you have 2 bytes to follow. So you can go from 1 to 4 using that kind of encoding scheme.
And probably I've left some things out, but now that we built up these concepts, what's a string? And I love that, by the way, I love the fact that your book starts with like this really hard question, actually, like what's a string? Because everybody who's done computer science thinks they know, but maybe you don't. So what's a string?
So a string is you just take that concept and you just keep adding more lists of bytes. And you keep on going and going and going and going and going. And then depending on the language or system or whatever you're using, you might have something called like an alternative byte, so you don't run off into memory and start stomping all over something you shouldn't be. But a string is just a collection of what might be a collection of bytes.
And amazingly, I imagine to like you, our non-technical listeners, all this makes sense now, and it's so interesting. And there's so much more to learn, which is great. And one of the reasons your book is 700 pages long, which is quite an accomplishment. Which gives me an opportunity to move on to the next part of the interview, where we talk about your life as a writer, and how do you go about writing a 700-page book? Did you was most of it from sort of, as you said, sort of your personal kind of documentation or blog posting that you'd been doing? Did you set yourself a writing schedule? Just how did you go about putting that together?
The ideas that came up in this book are born from like those kind of personal notes. This project, more than most, I kind of cleaned it up with an intended audience other than myself than I normally would. You want to repeat one of the questions? No problem. And so for example, do you have a writing schedule, for example, or do you just do you have there's an hour in the day when you tell your family like, don't bug me, I'm writing, or is it just random? No, with work and then, I got 4 kids now, and with the day job and everything, I got to be pretty strict about the time I carve out to actually do the writing. So with this, the general writing process, I'll sit down and be like, I know I want to get to this point eventually, kind of figure out who I want to talk to and explain this to, and then kind of work backwards, and then I'll outline a chapter. So if you think about it, there's a chapter in there about parsing Gherkin, a testing language. So then you kind of reverse engineer, like, what if I had to explain this to an imaginary person? What would a good set of logical steps be. And then you break down the chapter and outline it. And then from there, I would go through and kind of produce the final code sample and then start that same process working backwards and destructuring the code into logical bite-sized units. And once I have that usually takes about, that process I do on the weekends, on Saturday and Sunday. That might take about 4 weeks, depending on the size of the chapter, spending just a couple hours a day on it. And then once I have the outline, then there's a little thing that kind of clicks in your brain where you're just like, now I got to do it. So then you're going to wake up, between 4:30 and at 4:30 in the morning, then you're going to write it until 7, and then you get the kids ready for school, and then you do your work, and then at the end of the workday, then you're like, I'm going to write for another hour, and then you kind of just let it be, rinse and repeat.
Got it. Yeah, no, that's a really great description of a very, determined process, right? Like, I mean, in a couple senses of the term, right? Like, you've thought through in advance, like who this is for, and back out and like, kind of what you want to write about, but who's this for, and back out what you would want to say to that person so that they could understand it. And then once you've got, like, I'm an outliner myself. And so I totally identify with what you just described there, that like, I know where I am and I know where I want to go. And I know that, like, if I, sit down for this period of time, I might come out backwards. I might come out ahead, but at least I know at the end of that session, I'll know where I am in my project. And that's a way a lot of people, and there's other people who are like, just, sort of blah, just kind of get it all out there. And that's a very common writing approach as well. That's really popular with people. And I'm curious, do you explicitly solicit feedback from people on your books on Leanpub?
Not directly on Leanpub, but this project is one of the ones where I did kind of send out a few sample chapters to individuals, within the private network, and kind of like, hey, is this resonating with you? Or like, here's 2 different versions of the same thing. Which style are you liking more? Then you kind of pick and choose the people like that that kind of match closely with your imaginary person that you're trying to write for. Right. You don't tell them that, of course, but
no, that's a really interesting detail, actually. That not only do you have a sort of certain kind of audience in mind in general, but that you find specific people who are like representative of that audience, and sort of test out your approaches with them. That's a really excellent tactic. I think you have an answer for this last thing, but the last question I always like to ask on the podcast, if the guest is a Leanpub author, is if there was one thing that had you shouting at the screen and shaking your fist at Leanpub over and over again that we could fix for you, or if there was one magical feature that we could build for you, can you think of anything that you would ask us to do?
Yes, I have one very specific thing. It's so niche. So at the beginning of the book, I going back and forth between English and characters and Chinese characters quite often. And that kind of pattern repeats throughout the book periodically. But one of the reasons it doesn't is if you want to have that mix of English and Chinese characters, you have to set the book language to Chinese within the settings on Leanpub. So you get, the fonts are embedded correctly and everything. But that also has the side effect of it swaps pretty much all the locale, the published website, to then the table of contents and all the little blurbs that Leanpub adds automatically. That's all translated into Chinese.
Yeah. So just to explain what John's saying there, yeah, like a little bit more. Yeah, no, that's a really interesting. So what Leanpub has is we're proud of the fact that we support many different languages. You can write in plain text and write and publish books in all these different languages. But one thing we've also done is we've kind of localized the pages. So for example, many of the pages, and by the way, this is with the help of a lot of Leanpub authors. So for example, we only speak so many languages ourselves, right? But we basically did a Google Translate version, a really ugly Google Translate version of the book landing pages. So like, it says leave instead of book in French or something like that, right? And then we set up these a GitHub repo with all the different language files in it so that people could like update. They could basically make it better. The translation's better. So what happened? So when we were really proud of this. This is really good. But if you set a book to be a language that has been localized on Leanpub, so say you changed the language of your book to be Chinese, then your landing page on Leanpub will be Chinese, in Chinese. But so John's got this sort of, because there's so many Chinese characters in his book, it was better to just change the book language to be Chinese. But so I imagine that, but you didn't, but it's actually an English language book. So did you actually, and I'm curious, I don't know the answer, but did you actually like create a separate book that's set to the Chinese language in Leanpub that's just not published, and you use those files for your
Correct.
Which you set, and you set up a separate book in the upload writing mode. Okay, that now I understand what's going on there.
So then I would go through and I would do the previews with the self book, download all the files, then use a PDF editor to go back in there and relocalize all the content, change the every Leanpub book's got that little, this book was published on Leanpub, you can purchase here and it's got the little link. Then you make sure to update all of those links to point to the actual book, and then find all the little references that.
Oh my. Yeah. Oh, I know what you're describing now. Okay. Yeah. That's really interesting. Yeah, because there are all these the book, in addition to the landing page being kind of regularized for the web page for the book on Leanpub, there are, when we generate books, there are sort of typical kind of book content things like a copyright message, for example, right? And that's been localized as well, but there will be links to if you've, buy this book here, because ebook files can go anywhere, right? And so you actually have to go into a PDF editor and change the links to do that. Well, thanks very much for sharing that specific case. I will make a note of it. Definitely that this is probably something like that, because it's like what you're doing kind of totally makes sense, right? So it might be kind of rare that an author sort of is encountering that issue, so they need a proper kind of workaround. But a simple, just don't localize my web page or book tick box might be actually like a theme setting that we could set up that would hopefully resolve a lot of these issues.
Yeah, that would have been lovely.
Well, John, thank you very much for taking time out of your day to talk to me and talk to our audience. And thank you very much for using Leanpub as the platform in spite of all the difficulty. Thanks very much for using Leanpub as the platform for your really great book, which I definitely recommend to anybody. I mean, even if you're not a programmer, like that beginning section is just amazing.
Absolutely not a problem. It's been fun.
Thanks. And as always, thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the Front Matter Podcast. If you like what you heard, please rate and review it wherever you found it. And if you'd like to be a Leanpub author, please check out our website at leanpub.com. Thanks.